Good afternoon and welcome to the Queensland Media Club. I'm Peter Kelly from 3plus and I'll be sharing the MC duties today with Mark Ludlow from the Australian Financial Review, who'll be back after our main course to moderate the panel discussion. I'd like to acknowledge the Minister for Employment and Small Business and Minister for Training and Skills Development, the Honourable Di Farmer MP, who's with us today as we explore the state of Queensland business a year on from the COVID restrictions. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We have a full agenda today, so I encourage you to enjoy your meal while the sessions are underway. We're able to present these events only with the support of a list of sponsors, and I'd like to thank them. They are our principal naming rights sponsor, Brisbane Airport Corporation, the operator of Brisbane Airport, the multi-award winning Premier Gateway to Queensland, Dial Before You Dig, a national referral service for information on the location of utilities' underground assets anywhere in Australia, and Griffith University, created to be a different kind of university, challenging conventions, creating bold new trends and pioneering solutions. Ranked in the top 2% of universities worldwide, its future-focused degrees are developed in consultation with industry, based on cutting-edge research and taught by Australia's most awarded teachers. Please thank our naming rights sponsors. Our season partner is Arrow Energy, an integrated coal seam gas company working to meet domestic and international demand for cleaner energy. And our club partners are New Hope Group, a majority-owned Australian and Queensland-based diversified energy company with business interests and operations spanning coal mining, agriculture, exploration, port operation, oil and innovative technologies. And Telstra, whose purpose is to build a connected future so everyone can thrive. With a long and proud history of contributing to Queensland's economic and social development, Telstra is committed to staying close to its customers and providing them with the best experience, delivering the best tech on the best network. And finally, Shell QGC, one of Australia's leading natural gas producers, focused on developing Queensland's world-class onshore gas reserves. Please thank our season and club sponsors. Our venue partner is the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre, named the world's best convention centre and one of Queensland's great success stories. This venue was one of the first in Australia to reopen, operating on a COVID-safe plan approved by Queensland Health. I'm advised that the venue is hosting 8 events today, which suggests that confidence around events is certainly returning strongly. And finally, the managers of the Queensland Media Club, 3plus, specialists in risk and reputation management and strategic communications. Please thank our venue partner and our managers. And now to the CCIQ Pulse survey. Today's event coincides with the release of Queensland's largest survey of business confidence, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Queensland's Pulse survey. You have at your table a snapshot of the survey findings for the March quarter. It explores Queensland businesses' confidence, with more than 1,000 businesses taking part, and CCIQ analyses the data by region and by industry. The news is 84% of Queensland businesses continue to trade below capacity. And 47% are worried about the end of stimulus. This survey was taken in March, around the same time as the end of that stimulus. Now, of those 47%, 53% plan to make cuts to staffing levels once Jobkeeper ended. And 44% plan to pull back capital expenditure when the stimulus ended in March. Now, that lines up with ABS data, which shows that CapEx fell 25% in the March quarter, down some $1.6 billion. Despite that, overall confidence was significantly higher than it was prior to the COVID lockdown. And some more good news, manufacturing is looking like a big winner. Sentiment in that sector is up. Prior to COVID-19, manufacturing was the 8th strongest performing industry in Queensland, and it's been on a slide since the 1990s. Manufacturing is now Queensland's fifth strongest performing industry in the last quarter, behind property and business services, finance and insurance, healthcare and wholesale, and now ahead of education. No surprises there from our friends from Griffith University who are in the audience today, and also tourism. It's estimated that 1 in 5 imported supply chain products were exposed to the COVID-19 downturn. An example of that is a Queensland cosmetic manufacturer who was forced to reshore their packaging supply chain, that's plastics, bottles, cartons and the like, due to import constraints from China. The medical response across the globe created new opportunities for Queensland manufacturers able to pivot to the manufacture of PPE, and more than 4 in 5 manufacturers anticipate equal or stronger performance in the future. But costs are going up, labour and operational. 97% identify that as an issue. And that's impacting confidence. Sorry, I'm trying to work out where I am on this. There we go. And that's impacting confidence. According to the Pulse survey, business costs have returned to high levels, while profitability has only just returned to a satisfactory reading. Longer-term recovery is dependent on proportionate increase in profitability that will allow businesses to reinvest. In terms of long-term recovery, businesses are looking for certainty that comes from a consistent approach to hotspot and border closures. This was particularly evident in the tourism sector, where spot closures are affecting traveller confidence. Businesses are asking how long the term unprecedented will drive decision making. And then there's vaccination. Announcement of a vaccination program peaked business confidence, but at the end of March, vaccination targets were beginning to be missed. And CCIQ believes confidence may have dropped in the weeks since this survey was completed. 4 leaders of Queensland institutions have taken up the challenge to dissect the survey results and what they mean for our state's social, economic and policy landscape, 1 year after the first COVID-19 lockdowns and 1 week before the state budget is delivered. Our guest speakers today are from Sunsuper Chief Economist Brian Parker, from RACQ Bank Group Executive Banking Michelle Windsor, from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland Chief Executive Stephen Tate, and from BDO Australia, Chief Executive Partner Tony Schiffman. Please enjoy your meal. Mark Ludlow will be back after lunch to welcome our guests to the stage. Thank you.
Hope you've enjoyed your lunch and conversation with your guests here. My name is Mark Ludlow. I'm Brisbane Bureau Chief for the Australian Financial Review. I'll be moderating our panel discussion today, which is about looking at the state of the Queensland economy and business, I guess, a year into COVID-19. We'll have about a half-hour panel discussion before we throw to some Q&A from our other media here. There's only a couple of them there, so I've asked them to come up with 4 or 5 questions each, which I'm sure they will. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests up and invite them to come and grab a seat and a microphone. Our first is Sunsuper Chief Economist Brian Parker. He'll be joined by RACQ Group Executive Banking Michelle Windsor, CCIQ Chief Executive Stephen Tate, and BDO Australia Chief Executive Partner Tony Schiffman. Please welcome our guests.
Okay, thanks very much. Look, we will get on to the CCIQ Pulse survey because there's lots of interesting themes that come out of that, some of which are reflected in, I guess, the national economy and the response to COVID and how businesses are coping, but also some very Queensland-specific ones. I guess we might start generally sticking to the topic, which might be a good one to start with, looking at Queensland a year into the coronavirus. There was a lot of debate last year in the early days with the lockdowns about whether it was the right thing or not to do to shut state borders. There's no doubt a lot of Queenslanders felt very safe with the border shut. A lot of businesses may not have felt it as safe, especially if they were in affected industries like tourism. Borders are now open, apart from obviously city lockdowns, and we'll get onto that as well. The Victorian lockdown was announced is going to be ending on Thursday night. At least for those, there'll be easing of restrictions in regional Victoria, but Melbourne there'll be some easing of restrictions too. I guess now we've got the benefit of hindsight. looking down, can we just sort of start about, was it the right thing to do to shut up shop in relation to the Queensland budget? We might start with Brian. What are your thoughts?
Look, I think that it definitely was. If you think about the way the debate was progressing early on in the crisis, there was a number of voices saying no, that lockdowns and shutting up shop was the wrong thing to do, and they looked at various overseas examples about people like Sweden, for example, who took a different approach. And I think the jury is now back on the Swedish alternative. The Swedish economy did really no better or no worse than any of its neighbours, but you ended up with more dead Swedes per capita than you did dead Finns or Danes or Germans. So I think that sort of alternative approach of just letting things slide was mistaken. I think the other thing to note is that in the absence of formal lockdown measures, if infection rates get out of control, people lock themselves down. And you saw that with some of the data that comes out from people like Apple and Google, where they look at mobility trends from these ubiquitous phones that we all carry. Kind of frightening when you think just how much they can track us, but the data proved useful, and it did show that when infection rates were rising in a range of jurisdictions around the world, even if governments weren't doing anything to lock things down, people locked themselves down. Ultimately, people want to protect themselves, their family, and their friends. And I think that's certainly what we saw in Queensland. But the level of public support was strong enough certainly to return the current government. And that certainly was, WA was a more extreme example of that. I think by and large it was the right thing to do. As much as it was unsatisfactory in terms of efficiency, I know people say, but the virus doesn't respect borders, and that's fine, but the Constitution does. I think that state governments in particular did as well as could reasonably be expected, given the limitations of our constitutional structures, in my humble opinion.
So while the health authorities would have been would have been happy with the decision, and they've got a lot of sway these days in some ways, Jeanette Young's almost been like a deputy premier in the Palaszczuk government since the start of this pandemic. But I guess looking at it from a business point of view, it's interesting that Australia is a federal system, but you had state governments running their own little fiefdoms like they were countries, and you had differing perspectives as well, where Queensland was quite clear that they were going to shut up the borders. You had New South Wales, which took an alternative approach. We're saying we're going to try and keep it open. I guess the health authorities were happy. Looking at it from a business point of view, Stephen, can I go to you? What's the general feeling, though, from the business community? I know we kept hearing from the Treasurer, Cameron Dick, about saying it was great because, it allowed the economy to keep ticking over. Obviously, some other businesses that were tied to obviously international tourists are off the menu, but who were tied to interstate travellers were hurting. How do you think the economic situation was? Do you think Queensland made the right approach as opposed to a New South Wales which kept borders open?
I mean, speaking on behalf of our members from the Pulse survey, when you see the confidence level at its fastest in the whole of Australia, from the business community, you'd think, well, that does support that approach. But going forward, I think that's more of our concern. Because how do we have that national consistent approach to our borders? How do we actually put in place, policies that allow that confidence to return? Because when Melbourne goes into lockdown, it does affect us. It's our winter period, our tourism relies on Victoria. Visitors leaving Queensland are concerned about getting back into their states. So it does have a continuing effect on business. But business confidence has obviously increased quite significantly. But it's what we do now. How do we maintain that momentum? And I think that's the important part, because before COVID, we were seeing a slowdown in the economy and in confidence. It's returned, but how do we keep that going? And the way we do that is by giving a consistent and proportional response to that border closure, ensuring the vaccine rollout is better carried out nationally, and building confidence in business to invest back in the business. And that will come with that clarity and consistency of that policy with international borders.
Look, we will get more onto the Pulse survey in a minute, but I wanted to throw to Michelle about your thoughts. Obviously, state border lockdowns does seem to be an approach that was taken last year. It worked effectively from a public health point of view and also from an electoral point of view. If you're looking for in Queensland and WA, they're now trying to move to a sort of, a city lockdown approach. Do you think that it's the right approach now as opposed to a statewide lockdown?
So I think the thing that we've got to understand, Australia as an island, we should be able to contain things within the country. And I think that having the differences, Stephen's point on having the inconsistency across the country, I think that's a challenge, and particularly when you've got families who are spread across the country and interstate. And I think what it also does is it creates that uncertainty for people, uncertainty for making plans, uncertainty to book a trip or to do any travel. There has to be a better way to approach things, I think, than having each of the states having a totally different approach. I don't think that's an effective approach that helps people to be able to make the plans they want to, and to actually go and see the important people in their lives, which is often, only usually a drive away or a small flight away. So containing things, I think, is probably a better approach to particular areas. There was one of the recent lockdowns there, I think it was the Victorian one or the Queensland one, but the way that the Victorian government I thought about the Queensland lockdown just didn't make any sense, in that it was a lockdown of a particular suburb, but they said that anybody from that area couldn't actually return. So I think we've got to have a lot more of a common sense approach, that if it's in a particular area, let's contain it to that area. If I'm an hour away from that, then I should be safe to actually continue to travel within the country. So I think there's got to be a better way to approach it.
Tony, can I get your thoughts? And then obviously it does seem now, though, that Australia is pursuing this elimination approach. Our Victorian, I think it might have been 10 or 12 cases a day before they decided to do effectively a 14-day shutdown. Is it just going to be a fact of life in the Australian economy for the next 12 months, perhaps longer, that this is going to be the approach taken?
It is, but having made the mistake in the last 2 months of trying to do travel in Australia, it is really almost impossible. I've got multiple apps on my phone, depending on which state I'm going to. You've got to be constantly looking at websites. I'll quote an example in BDO. So our chairman is Melbourne-based. He's based in Byron Bay most of the time. We had a meeting in Adelaide 2 weeks ago. They changed the rules 6:30 the night before he flew down. So he's checking the website in the afternoon. No, and he thought he was fine. He flew into Adelaide, and then they said, "No, sorry, you've been in Melbourne this time," and so forth, and they had to have a COVID test and self-isolate. So the rules keep changing. They're different, and they're almost impossible to follow. So mobility is a core issue. Surely we have one app and one process in Australia, so it literally is, I'm not exaggerating, it is almost impossible to understand what you've got to do, and you get caught out easily. And so I've been caught out myself, thinking I knew what to do, how to get there, and having been, as I said, in most places recently, when I get there, the plane, there's people get there and they don't know what they're going to do, and they're just scared of, I didn't realise when I go to Adelaide I've got to have a border pass I've got to apply for 10 days before, and have an app and so forth. So it is, but it is humorous. I was in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago, and they put you this big test. All these people look like policemen that aren't, and then they go through the interview process, and at the end they give you a raffle ticket, like a little ticket. I said, "What do I do with that?" And they said, "I don't know, just walk out." And I just walked out. So I walked out with a raffle ticket. So, what we're going to do with the raffle ticket?
You didn't win a meat tray for to go
I was looking for the meat tray, and I didn't get one. But I got a raffle ticket at the end. So,
Brian, I saw you about to say. So I guess, is this sustainable though? Obviously, I guess the question is: it sustainable having this kind of system where there's inconsistencies between? You even look at it in the vaccine rollout. Trying to work out, some states are still trying to focus on over 50s, other people are moving 40 to 49. I think the Northern Territory is doing anyone over 16 at the moment. There is inconsistencies there. Surely there has to be some kind of economic cost for having these inconsistent systems.
Yeah, there is. And one of the things I do find kind of puzzling is this whole idea that the National Cabinet approach worked brilliantly. What's the evidence for that? I don't see evidence for that. I currently have a collection of 5 state apps on my phone. I'm wondering whether I get a raffle ticket by getting the full set by the end of the year, which is insane. Wouldn't it be nice to have had an app that was actually rolled out nationally that actually worked from the get-go? I mean, we have, what we've seen in action is the limitations in the modern world of a federal structure that was built at the turn of the 1900s. it's not fit for purpose. Now, unless you can tell me that that's going to change dramatically in the next 12 months, then frankly, this is what we're living with. Which is hence my point before about, look, I think we've managed it as well as possible given the limitations of our federal structure. Could we have done a lot better on the IT side of things, having a national app that worked? I would have thought that would have been a no-brainer, but you know, I'm just a humble economist. I think also one of the bigger picture issues of this is that we've managed it as well as possible given the limitations of our public sector's resources. One of the things that irritates me as an economist is for too many years, whenever state and federal budgets have been announced, there's always, or quite often, there's one line of the budget saying, oh, we think we can save money by a so-called efficiency dividend. We've seen that in the budgets, heard that phrase? Now, there's a limit to how many years you can go by imposing efficiency dividends on the public sector before all of a sudden you starve the public sector of needed resources. And you may be able to get away with that for years, but when you get a crisis like COVID, that's when you need a public sector that is adequately resourced with the kind of technology and the kind of people that can step up and solve problems. We haven't had that in the last year. I think it's, you know, I think the public sector has done as well as possible given the limitations of our structure and given the limitations with which we funded the public sector over the last 20 or 30 years.
We will get onto the CCIQ Pulse survey. One of the key themes out of that was business confidence being tied to the level of vaccination. We're talking then before about the inconsistencies between states with border closures, different apps, that kind of things. It doesn't really fill you with much hope about getting confidence back with vaccine. And I always looked at the UK. It copped a lot of flack for a pretty ordinary response when COVID first started. But since then, and I haven't looked into it in detail, but they've done a pretty amazing job with getting a rollout. And I sometimes wonder, is it because they've got a national government? They've got counties, but they don't have a federal system like us. Whereas in Australia here, we have state governments, each running their states or territories like their own country. Does that fill you with much confidence about the vaccination rate? And I was talking to my colleagues, my other bugbear is the Commonwealth government every day, the health department puts out their figure of how many people have received a vaccine dose, and it's trumpeted, it's 4 million or 5 million, whatever it is these days. They do not put the figure in there about how many people are fully vaccinated. And they do that because the figure is something like 500,000 or about 2 or 3% of the total adult population. And that just sums it all up where there's been a bit of spin on that. But I guess onto the vaccine rollout, is it fair to say you're not filled with, anyone can jump in here, you're not filled with much confidence about the success of the vaccine rollout?
I would tie it to a business issue. We need to get vaccinated so we get back into business, okay? There's a clear issue here we need to solve, and the narrative has got to be around what's the future for Australia, what's the future for business, and at the moment we don't have that. It's all a conversation around numbers of vaccines. We need people mobile, we need to bring skills into the country. There's so many business issues that come off the back of vaccination, and I think that's the narrative we're going to talk about, the near-term future. I can tell you from other countries are having that conversation. They are mobile, they are moving, or if they're not, they actually have plans in the foreseeable future to move people around, to do business and so forth. We have so many challenges here at the moment because of supply chain issues, lack of capability of bringing people in, skills and so forth, and that's causing really business issues. So that's where I see the whole vaccine issue being so important to business in the short term, and that's what we should be talking more about.
I think to your point, Mark, is if we rely simply on that as being the silver bullet, I think that's a fair way out from a line of sight. I think that we've got to have clarity and consistency on what our approach will be around some of the policy settings, like what is our response going to be in the interim with regards to if there are outbreaks, what's the proportionate response, because businesses can't plan if they're getting phone calls on a Friday afternoon to say, from tomorrow you're shut down for 3 weeks. The impact at cost, both physically, financially, emotionally on a business, it removes their confidence to be investing in their business going forward. I know Western Australia and Victoria had a form of rescue package applied to short-term lockdowns, but I think giving a line of sight of what will happen in the near future if that was to happen again. What are the policy settings we're going to have in place to support the restaurant that's just spent all of this money on food? That we are actually having to stand down our staff at short notice who rely on that money. So I think we have to have a broader conversation about putting confidence back into business with regards to some of those policy settings, because people aren't being employed if we're not confident about our future. They're not encouraging people to come back into the regional areas because they're concerned about the future economy driven by a vaccine. I think we all have a role in business to encourage that for that very reason. But you know, it has to be a voluntary approach. But what's the number, what's the goal that we need to achieve and allow us to take advantage of that silver bullet?
Michelle, did you want to jump in there, or you look like you were wanting to say?
I think it's. I think that's Stephen's made a really, really good point there, and I think the vaccination is a long-term strategy, and I think the thing we've got to understand when in running businesses as well is that the vaccination doesn't stop there from being cases. It just reduces the impact of the effects of the virus. So, you know, as we run businesses, it's not the only solution is the thing I think we need to think about. Because if I'm running a business and somebody has had vaccinations in my business, but they can still get the virus, then what do I do with that business where I've got weddings booked for a weekend, or I've got you know, a full restaurant full of bookings? So it is absolutely important for us to really drive that rollout, and we do need, I think, a national approach. But I think it's important for us to understand it's not the only solution. We've then got to think about how do we actually respond in the times when we have these cases. To Tony's point earlier, we're going to have cases going forward.
I think the interesting thing for me was the fact that so much of the economic policy debate, especially the fiscal policy settings in Canberra, was so heavily reliant on the fact that, you know what, by 31 March, we're going to have X percentage of the population vaccinated. That's going to go so smoothly that we can afford to turn Jobkeeper off on 31 March. When that became very, very clear, well before 31 March, that the vaccine rollout was not, it was a vaccine stroll out, that they had to actually, there was a case to tweak those fiscal policy settings, and they didn't do that, at least not until relatively recently. And I think I'm pleased that with the renewed Victorian lockdown, at least the Federal Treasurer has come out and they have been indicated that where there is periodic lockdowns required, that the Feds are prepared to step up and provide some temporary support. That's very, very welcome, but frankly, they kind of took their time in that. Look, I do think we do need to live with the periodic outbreaks, and we do need to live with the fact that we will not eliminate this disease for many years, if ever. But again, faster vaccine rollout is absolutely critical. And to me, that's really the main game at this point. That's the best thing we can do to at least attempt to live vaguely normal lives and open borders and get things happening again.
Stephen, there are lots of key themes that came out of the latest pulse survey. Obviously, a key one that jumped out at me was about 84% of businesses still continuing to trade below capacity. That's even with a lot of government stimulus being pumped into the community. I guess there was concerns about Jobkeeper being turned off. There's still lots of state government stimulus in the system. Can you talk to that point, and should we be concerned that businesses, even though, you know, it's Fortress Australia and the economies are meant to be ticking back along again, that, you know, 84% still haven't got back to where they were a year ago?
Yeah. I mean, the business sentiment is a good barometer of what could be, and what we're seeing is a moment in time of, yes, they've not bounced back to where they were prior to COVID, but they are confident that they can get there with the right policy settings. And I think that businesses are looking for what's going to help us get to that back to before COVID, and it's going to require support around the diversification of their businesses, making them more resilient, upskilling them, supporting them in the digitisation of their business. They're looking for direct support that's going to help them go back to that. There are pockets of you know, good outcomes through COVID, as they say, never waste a good crisis. The manufacturing figures and the manufacturing sentiment is significantly improved.
I'm saying that's one of the bright spots there.
Yeah, and you know, thank goodness for that. But when you look at what our future economy could be driven by, it will be in that, you know, high-value manufacturing sector. And I think,
is that sustainable, though, that you think? Or is that just a blip that's come up out of...
No, I think it's absolutely sustainable if we're given the right... I mean, we have an enormous opportunity in Queensland to take advantage of that. When we've got, you know, the natural resources that we have, the focus on sustainability and sustainable business practices. It will drive skills, it will drive our technology, it will drive our new industries, it will attract new industry as well. So I don't think it may not be sustainable looking at traditional industries and manufacturing, but that high value manufacturing, we can compete on a global stage with that. And I think it's incumbent on us to build on what that could be to maintain that growth, because the supply chain that cascades off that cascades all the way through the community. And I think that's where we are looking to see government continue to invest in that, specifically in the regions. Because we have, I spoke to a business yesterday, he's a manufacturer, a steel manufacturer. He's now put in technology, a whole floor of his factory has got 7 or 8 technology doing virtual reality. He's so positive about the future. His business is going through the roof. And we're actually seeing businesses looking to them to source higher quality products at a higher price because it's being manufactured here. So I think it has got that cascading approach. So whilst it's been a short term, business 84% haven't bounced back, I think we have got to see what this new budget coming out will set that path to the future economy going forward and confidence.
I guess it's another key theme that comes out is the patchy nature of the economy. Obviously, if you were a tourism business in Cairns that was connected to the international tourists, you've had half of your market blown up over a short period of time, and for a lot of those people, they've been told, oh, we'll just go to the domestic market, but for some that doesn't fill the gap. If you're a tourism operator in Noosa, you probably had an awesome 12 months because people have been trapped here. You're within the drive distance to 2 major cities. I guess it's one of those ones. Some sectors are booming, some aren't. One other key theme out of the survey was rising labour costs. I don't know if anyone's been able to try and lock in a tradie or get a home renovation done. There's certain things with people being trapped here and not travelling overseas. There's big rising business costs. I just wonder if some of you could talk through that. Tony, I might jump to you.
Yeah, I could talk that from both from a CCIQ point of view, but also from a BDO point of view. We can't think of a client type that's not seeing some real cost pressures. Okay, in the labour side as well as other issues too. So just talking on the labour side. For many years it's probably been pretty benign. It's probably 1 or 2, 3%, 4%, that sort of thing. I would say on average we're talking 6 to 10% in a lot of businesses. That's hugely problematic because a lot of businesses have pricing discretion, but not that much pricing discretion quickly. So I think these cost pressures are going to mean that this recovery is got some question marks on it. So I think the headlines at the moment, lots of opportunity, lots of growth, but cost pressures are real. And supply chain, just an average laptop is probably going to be 20%, 15, 20% more than what it was 12 months ago. That's just one example, and there's lots and lots and lots of those examples. So I think cost pressures generally, but labour costs and the widespread, I'm talking unskilled as well as skilled labourers and even humble accountants, we can't get them. So there used to be a dime a dozen, but they're hard to get now.
Brian, do you want to jump in on that, on the implications of that kind of?
Yeah, humble accountants, that's a new one.
There's lots of them, they're all around.
Shy economists, yeah, that's right. My joyous message.
It's more accurate economists, isn't it? They're meant to be doing
that. No, it's going to get worse. And it's going to get worse by design, make no mistake. If I was sitting in economic analysis at the Reserve Bank and I was hearing anecdotes of businesses having to pass on higher wages, I'd say great. Because I've just gone through a decade where I haven't hit my inflation target, where wages have been growing too slowly, and we need to get household income and spending to accelerate in a meaningful and sustained way. And the way you do that is that you boost incomes, you boost wages, and ideally that shows up in higher unit labour costs and higher prices. That is an aim of monetary policy has been trying to achieve that for the last decade, and it's missed consistently. Before the last federal budget, 2 weeks prior, Treasurer Frydenberg gave a speech where he basically acknowledged that now is not the time for austerity, that now is the time to make sure that the recovery is solidified, and that means not slamming on the brakes, not tightening fiscal policy too soon, getting unemployment down well comfortably below where it was pre-COVID, because make no mistake, if all we're going to do is to get back to a labour market that existed pre-COVID, then we're going to have wage inflation and price inflation, which is still going to be subpar, where people are still going to get nothing in the way of a decent wage increase, and that's not really a recipe for success. And I get, you know, when you, if you're in business, it's often very, very hard to make the point or to accept the point that your employee, the people you pay a wage to, are also either your customer or someone else's customers. You know, we want to see faster wage and price inflation. This is part of a healthier long-term economic story. But I acknowledge that it is going to pose significant costs and challenges, especially for those businesses that don't have immediate pricing power. So my cheery summary of that little rant is that it's not going to get any better, it's going to get worse by design.
We might just cover one more area before I throw to my colleagues on the media table. Obviously next week is the state budget. It's pretty clear that there's not going to be much economic pain or financial austerity to claw back some of the escalating debt, which is now due to top 130 billion by 2033-34. I'm sure once we see next week's budget papers, it's going to be higher than that. It's been a pretty calculated decision by state and federal treasurers, probably under the cover of COVID, but I think they made the decision before COVID that the average punter doesn't care about debt, and it's a lot easier to just increase overall debt rather than raise taxes or cut government services. Should we be concerned about the escalating level of debt? Should there be some plan to eventually pay it back? And what are the panellists expecting from next week's budget? I might start with Michelle.
Well, I might just put in a bit of a plug for what RSEQ is actually looking for from the budget. We were hoping that the government would invest in some infrastructure projects on some of our key roads across the state. I mean, travel in Queensland by driving in Queensland congestion is worse than before COVID. So it's really interesting to actually understand that we need to invest in public transport across the state, and there's some of the key things that we would be hoping that they would be supporting with and actually focusing on some of those infrastructure projects.
Agree, especially in the regions, in terms of quality of life for people working in the regions. I absolutely agree. Do we need to repay the debt? No. There's this idea that governments need to repay debt. That assumes that governments are like households and we have a finite life, which is a myth. And the sooner we destroy that myth, the better. Governments have an infinite life, and governments do not need to repay debt. They do need to refinance it periodically. But this idea that the optimum level of government debt is zero is a myth. And so I'm probably more relaxed about debt than perhaps some commentators are. The best analogy I can think of for what we've been through right now is really, if I think about the history, the build-up in debt during World War II, during World War I, during Korea, and the solution to that was getting an economy back to growth, getting inflation up, and bringing debt to GDP and debt to income ratios down. That is ultimately how you resolve this. That and a combination of the fact that just as with military spending during a war, health spending during a pandemic, much of which is temporary, comes to a natural end. So I'm relatively relaxed at this point on debt. I think the government is perhaps paying a political, I wouldn't say paying a political price, that's the wrong phrase, but this is a government federally that spent a lot of years using debt and deficits as a stick with which to beat the opposition. They're kind of perhaps regretting that now, and rightly so, because it was always a dumb argument. So they managed to convince a lot of people that debt and deficits really mattered. And I'm not saying they don't matter at all, but they matter a hell of a lot less than the government has been claiming for the last decade. Now they have a communication challenge, but in my view, they do not have a debt challenge.
Tony, you want to jump in on the state budget?
Yeah, I think that's the case. Economics wasn't my best subject at uni, but
never was for any accountant.
Yeah, exactly.
Just
it was boring. Having heard the benefit of people like Brian, but also the Reserve Bank Governor through the Chamber of Commerce, we meet with him. It is about the size of the economy, and so it's the debt to the size of the economy. And so all governments, whether they're federal or state, have got to make this decision: do I invest in infrastructure or whatever and grow the economy, or do I stop and do nothing and we stabilise, or do I try and move to an austerity measure setting and potentially blow the economy up? So I think it is it's debt to the size of the economy, and if you can grow the economy, then to some extent it's not irrelevant, but that's the major measure. How'd I go?
Not bad, actually. Good.
Stephen, you just want to jump in quickly before I throw to my colleague?
I'll go to the same theme, is that it's not necessarily paying down the debt, it's what choices are we going to make to invest in the future economy. And right now, when we go through the state budget, we obviously speak quite closely with the government on a number of issues that we see being what the future economy will be driven by. The number 2 issue that businesses told us with regards to the state budget was support and encouragement and investment in the future of sustainable practices within businesses. Because the operating costs, as well as the economy is driven by traditional methods of manufacturing, how do we help businesses transform and diversify and make them more resilient? Because in Queensland, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a flood or whether it's a fire, it's how do we build resilience into these regions? So where's that investment going to be? Well, it's going to be in smarter infrastructure, not just roads and rails, but if you can't get digital service out west, we need to look at that part. We need to look at smart infrastructure. We need to look at the future of skills, not just to the current issues, but there is an opportunity for us to look at what apprentices should we be looking at to build on for the future skill. It might not just be chippies and sparkies, but these people are going to have to support robotics and data. And so there's an element of skilled workforce in the future of that. So there's smart infrastructure, skilled workforce. There is an opportunity for us to invest in the future economy. And I think that sustainability part is coming through strong and hard on how we can actually support businesses on that journey.
No worries. I might throw to my colleagues on the media table. Jessica?
Hello. Okay. Jessica Marsluke from the Courier Mail. Given you guys spoke a lot about the vaccine and that being the reason for the confidence in the Pulse survey coming back, I was interested in hearing from you all around where do you see the public debate and the debate around business going once everyone who will be vaccinated has been vaccinated, and then we have to have a conversation about when do we open the borders, when do we talk about relaxing the rest of the business restrictions when there'll still be a sizable chunk of the population who won't get vaccinated?
I think that was the conversation that we touched on earlier, is what is that end point and when do we start that conversation? Well, that conversation should be starting now at a national level. It shouldn't be waiting until we get what happens if. And I think that's our frustration as a chamber movement. We're part of a federated model where we are putting forward recommendations now on that step change to building the journey back to not business as usual, but business post-COVID. And we're having to have that conversation now. And that consistent approach, both at a federal and a state level, is more important than ever before. I think business has that advocacy function to bring that and force that to the table at a national level, because we will get to the vaccination rates that we need. But what are we going to do between now and then? Well, that's a conversation we should be having now.
Yeah, I agree. I know through the state chambers and the federal chamber, we are promoting policies settings for the federal government. So they don't want to talk about it. They should talk about it, because the reality of life is we can't. I don't think we can keep the borders closed forever. Not that I look at. So I think we've just got to take people on a journey. Now, clearly, there's an inflection point between scaring everybody and not. But I think this reality that somehow we don't have to open up is just a nonsense. It's going to have to happen. So someone's got to lead that conversation, and I think the federal level's got to do that at some stage. I would have thought.
The only thing I would add to what's been already said is it's got to move away from a political discussion to actually what's the right thing for Australia as a country. And I don't think that's happened throughout. It's been political in each of the states with the decisions that have been made, and I just don't think that's the right approach here. It needs to be, we're dealing with a health pandemic, global health pandemic. We need to actually address things with a common sense approach.
But there's also too, this is probably a hard for a politician to lead, but what is the opportunity post this? I suspect there's a massive opportunity if you think about it. Australia's had a great response to COVID, not a bad place to live. If you're in the UK, I suspect probably coming to Australia to work might be a good thing. So there's a conversation around future industry, future skills. What does Australia look like going forward post this? I think there's a really positive story if we want to think about it.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's spot on, and especially given that my great fear is that we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by firstly being too slow with the rollout, and secondly not being able to capitalise on the success to date and hopefully the eventual touch wood success of a rollout. You know, getting things like, I don't know, call it vaccine passports, call it, you know, how do we leverage our success into promoting our universities as education destinations? I mean, because potentially we've done damage there to our reputation amongst overseas students and prospective overseas students, because we did leave some of our overseas students, a lot of them, high and dry. As well as leaving a number of our universities high and dry. And, you know, we talk about wanting to promote skills, etc., and more sophisticated manufacturing. Frankly, I don't believe you do that without a very robust and high quality higher education sector, just quietly. And I'm not saying that just to appease the Griffith University table either, by the way, but I do get a slight, thank you very much. But yeah, we've got a massive opportunity, but I do hope that we're working on the solutions, you know, I think some sort of vaccine passport mechanism, you know, how do you actually allow people to actually take advantage of the fact that they've been vaccinated? The reward for being vaccinated shouldn't just be this smug feeling of superiority, although I have that. But, you know, I couldn't agree more, basically.
I got vaccinated. I got my injection on Friday, and they actually update immunisation register. So if you go onto your MyGov app, it comes up with a PDF
Fantastic.
of your immunisation register. That's a passport.
Great.
That's a passport, I think. I'm not sure.
But I think an answer to your question as well, though, is that we have to give future businesses future scope to invest and give them confidence to invest. And if you think of Australia as a whole, you know, we're a safe haven. We're politically stable. We're financially good. We've got a skilled workforce. We should be attracting the future industries to this country. And more importantly, we should be attracting them to Queensland. And I think that we've got to have that conversation about how we can leverage that now, because people are looking to invest in our country. We have a stable fiscal responsibility to do so, so we have to do it.
Is there another question there from the media table?
Matt Deneen from Brisbane Times. There's a lot of talk about the opportunities for manufacturing going forward now, but obviously that's despite these 84% of businesses saying they're still trading below their pre-COVID capacities. Maybe one for you more specifically, Stephen, but which sectors are there any standouts represented in that group that are of particular concern? There's probably a few that I could think of, but what, I guess, needs to be done specifically for those groups?
For the ones that are of concern, or the ones that are powering on?
The ones that are of concern, yeah.
I think given our views on what the future budget should look like, it's an answer to that. We need to support them in that digital capacity and capability building. We have to make sure that we're supporting them with the right employment and skills to do so. We have to have an investment pipeline where they can benefit from part of that procurement. We have to make it easy to do business. And it's all very well to give fiscal support to a business, but how do we make it easier to do business? How do we reduce that barrier and cost of doing business? Contrary to popular belief, you know, businesses do want to pay more for their wages. They do want to have happy staff. They do want to look after them. I've yet to meet any one of my members who believe otherwise. But when the cost of compliance and regulation, the lack of opportunities or the difficulties in participating in procurement opportunities, it doesn't allow them to do so, not to mention the need for an overhaul of the tax system nationally. The number one thing that we always talk about is payroll tax as being a major barrier. But at the end of the day, unless there's national reform in the taxation component, that's not going to happen. So how do we use that as a lever to incentivise improve productivity through, if you invest in a piece of technology, we'll reduce your payroll tax if it can actually help you improve your profitability in doing so. So I think that skilling component, having a line of sight on future infrastructure, making sure that they're digitally capable, these are the sort of things that need to be done now. And that's something that we've agitated for in our state budget submission. But in terms of the regional area is a big concern for us. And I think that helping them on that sustainability journey is an absolute imperative. And we've got consumers and people now making conscious choices on what they buy, how much they pay for it, based on a lot of these social factors now. And we need to help businesses do that. I mean, there's a commitment by government to achieve, the zero carbon emission by 2050. How are we going to do that? Well, we can't afford to just tax businesses to do that. We actually have to give them the support to do that. And businesses want to do that. As I said, it's their number 2 priority in the budget submission, or their budget requirement, is the support to do that and to go on that journey. Our chamber will be the first chamber, I think, in Australasia to be carbon neutral by the 1st of July. And we're doing it to go down that process to find out how difficult it is and how challenging it is, so that we can use that as an example, because the last thing we want is taxing our way to a government target. We've actually got to put in place the right environment and incentives to do so. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think we're pretty much out of time. Unless was there one more question there from the media tool?
Just have a real quick one. Given Brian's comments around the public sector, I wondered what the panel made of the hiring freeze in the past year, and whether that's impacted. Obviously, the public service is responsible for a lot of the business settings, and I wondered how that hiring freeze, how that had impacted on the points you were making around, needing this, public service.
Can I start with that? I thought they were unhelpful. I thought public sector pay freezes, hiring freezes, at a time of severe economic hardship, I thought was utterly unhelpful, because at the margin it adds to the economic pain unnecessarily. And that's just really economics 101. It almost works against what you're trying to do with other arms of policy. So at a time when you're trying to protect people's jobs and boost incomes, to then turn around to your public servants, many of whom are the front line of this crisis, and to tell them, no, you're just not getting a pay rise for the next 12 months. I thought that was just unnecessarily harmful in my view. And I think there is something to be said, notwithstanding the concerns of the panel about businesses facing higher labour costs, but from a macro policy perspective, if you want to encourage faster wages growth in the economy, you don't do that by public sector wage freezes. There's a case to be said, there's a case to be made for the public sector to perhaps be a bit of a benchmark setter in some cases. So I thought that a lot of those decisions on pay freezes and hiring freezes were kind of unhelpful. I get the so-called fiscal imperative that you had money to spend on other things, but frankly, the difference that those things made to the bottom line of the budget was so trivial that you caused a bit of pain, you caused a lot of irritation in your frontline workers for very, very little fiscal benefit. And for actually at least some marginal economic harm as well. So I thought they were really unhelpful.
Look, I think we're pretty much out of time now, so I hope everyone got something out of the conversation. Can you please thank Brian, Michelle, Stephen and Tony?
Thanks again for everyone's attendance today. Please visit the Queensland Media Club's website for a visual recording of today's speech, proudly sponsored by JPL Media. I'd once again like to acknowledge our naming rights sponsors, Brisbane Airport Corporation, Dial Before You Dig and Griffith Uni, as well as our other sponsors. Our next Media Club event will be the Queensland Deputy Premier Stephen Miles on June 22. He'll be speaking on the state budget, which is next week, as well as voluntary assisted dying. Not necessarily for guests. Invites will be sent out this week, but please make a note in your diaries. That brings an end to this lunch. Thanks for your attendance.